The wind was a blade against Elias Vance's face, sharp enough to peel the skin from the bone. It howled through the high passes of the granite peaks he called home, a lonely god in a vacant heaven. Snow fell not in flakes but in a solid, blinding sheet, erasing the world he had so carefully built and then abandoned. He was checking the north fence line, a ritual born of habit rather than necessity, for no sane thing, man or beast, would be out in this blizzard. His horse, a sturdy gray gelding named Ghost, stamped a hoof, muscles trembling beneath a coat of ice. Elias pulled his collar tighter, the wool scratching at a jawline hard as the surrounding rock. He had come to this mountain to be alone with his ghosts, but the mountain itself was a more demanding companion, and he respected its power. That was when he saw it, a dark shape against the impossible white, a smudge of ruin half buried in a fresh drift near the ancient, wind-stunted pines. It was too small for a fallen tree, too still for an animal. A part of him, the part that had walled his heart in stone, wanted to turn Ghost around and ride back to the warmth of his cabin. Whatever lay in the snow was the world's problem, and he was no longer part of the world. But the part of him that was once Governor Vance, the man who had stood for order and protection, that part was not yet dead. It was merely sleeping. He nudged Ghost forward, the horse moving reluctantly through the deepening snow. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a human form, a woman, her dark cloak a funeral shroud against the snow. She was curled around something, protecting it even in collapse. Two small bundles. Children. Elias dismounted, his boots sinking to his knees. The cold was a physical blow, a pressure on his chest. He knelt, his gloved hands brushing snow from her face. It was young, pale as milk, framed by strands of black hair frozen to her skin. Her lips were blue, but he saw the faintest mist of breath. She was alive. He looked at the children she held. Their faces, peeking from the folds of her cloak, were identical. Twins. A boy and a girl, their eyes closed, their cheeks unervingly still. He pressed his fingers to their necks, one after the other. A pulse, faint and thready as a spider's silk, but there. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency that had been dormant for a decade. He could not carry all three and lead the horse. He unlashed the oilcloth-wrapped buckskin from his saddle, spreading it on the snow. He lifted the children first, their bodies shockingly light, and placed them on the hide. Then he went back for the woman. As he gathered her into his arms, her eyes fluttered open. They were a deep, wild green, filled with a terror so profound it struck him silent. Her lips moved, but only a dry crackle emerged. "Please," she breathed, a sound like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. Then her eyes rolled back, and she was gone again. He laid her beside her children, wrapped the buckskin around them, and secured the bundle. Getting it onto Ghost's back was a fight against the wind and the dead weight of their bodies. A brutal struggle that left him gasping, his lungs burning. He led the horse back toward the faint promise of smoke from his chimney, a gray finger pointing to a merciless sky. He did not let himself think about the last time he had carried a woman and child from a disaster. He had walled that memory away for a reason. Inside the cabin, the fire in the stone hearth was the only sound. It crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn log walls. Elias had stripped them of their frozen clothes, wrapping them in his own woolen blankets and laying them on makeshift beds near the warmth. The woman lay on his cot, the twins on a pallet of furs before the fire. He worked methodically, heating water, checking their breathing. They were bone-weary and starved, but the cold had not yet claimed them. As he gently washed the grime from the woman's face with a warm cloth, he saw the bruise. A dark, ugly stain blooming on her cheekbone, the yellowing edges suggesting it was days old. He saw another on her temple, hidden by her hairline. His hands, which had been gentle, tightened on the cloth. He turned his attention to the children. They were perhaps 6 years old, their faces mirror images of each other. As he wiped away the tear-streaked dirt, he saw the scars. They were not accidents. On the boy's left cheek and the girl's right, a single, deliberate line, thin and silvery white. A brand. A mark of ownership. Elias felt a cold that had nothing to do with the storm outside. It was the ice of a buried rage, a familiar fury he had thought long extinguished. He stood and stoked the fire, the poker clanging against the grate with more force than necessary. He was a man who had made his peace with violence, who knew its shape and its cost. This, the deliberate scarring of a child's face, was not violence. It was desecration. The woman woke hours later. The storm had lessened to a mournful sigh against the windows. She sat up with a gasp, her green eyes wide with panic, searching the room. They landed on the twins, asleep by the fire, and a measure of the terror receded, replaced by a wary exhaustion. Her gaze then found Elias, who sat in a chair across the room, cleaning a rifle, the lamplight glinting off the oiled steel. He had not moved for an hour, simply watching, waiting. He set the rifle aside. "There's broth on the stove," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. She flinched at the sound, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She said nothing. He saw the calculation in her eyes, judging the distance to the door, the weight of the poker by the fire, the size of him. He was a large man, his shoulders broad, his hands calloused and capable. He knew what she saw, another threat. He stood slowly, keeping his hands open and away from his body. He ladled the broth into a clay mug and set it on the small table beside her cot. He backed away and returned to his chair. "Eat," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument but lacking any overt menace. She watched him for a long time, her gaze flickering between him and her children. Finally, her hunger won. She drank the broth in slow, careful sips, never taking her eyes off him. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the fire and the sleeping breaths of the children. Days bled into one another, measured by the rhythm of the enduring storm. Elias established a routine. He would rise before dawn, tend the fire, check on his guests, and then go out to see to the horse and chop wood. He left food and water for them and otherwise kept his distance, offering them the gift of his absence. The woman, who he learned was named Alara when he heard her whisper it to her waking son, began to move about the small space. She cared for the twins, Finn and Willow, with a fierce, silent devotion. They remained as quiet as stones, their large, dark eyes following Elias's every move. They did not speak. Not a word. Not a cry. Alara's fear slowly began to curdle into a cautious curiosity. This man was not like the other. He did not crowd her, did not demand anything from her. His quiet was not the simmering prelude to a storm, but a deep, settled thing, like the bedrock of the mountain itself. She watched his hands as he mended a leather strap or sharpened an axe. They were strong hands, scarred hands, but they were steady. One afternoon, she found him staring at a small, faded photograph on the mantelpiece. A smiling woman with kind eyes and a young girl with a missing front tooth. He didn't know she was watching until she spoke, her voice still raspy. "Your family?" He flinched, not from her presence, but from the word. He turned, his face a mask of granite. He simply nodded, then placed the photograph face down. The conversation was over, but it was a beginning, a crack in the wall of silence. The next day, while he was outside, she washed the few dishes and swept the floor. When he returned, he noticed but said nothing. He simply added another log to the fire. An unspoken transaction had occurred. Shelter for work. Fair trade. The children were the bridge. One evening, Finn, the boy, walked over to where Elias was splitting kindling by the hearth. The man paused, his hatchet resting on the block. The boy looked at the pile of wood, then at Elias. He picked up a small piece of cedar and held it out. His small hand trembled, but his gaze was steady. Elias looked at the offering, then at the boy's face, at the pale, thin scar that marred its perfection. He reached out and took the piece of wood, his large, rough fingers brushing the child's. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice softer than Alara had ever heard it. The boy scurried back to his sister's side, but a connection had been made. A week later, the blizzard broke. Sunlight, thin and watery, streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The world outside was a pristine, silent expanse of white. The isolation was no longer forced by the storm, but by the sheer geography of the place. With the return of the sun, a deeper tension settled over Alara. The end of the storm meant the world could find them. It meant he could find them. That night, she woke from a nightmare. A strangled cry caught in her throat. Silas's face, twisted in rage, had been inches from hers. Elias was awake instantly, sitting upright in his chair by the dying fire. He didn't speak, just watched her as she fought to control her ragged breathing. Her hand went to her cheek, where the memory of a blow still lingered. She looked at her sleeping children, their chests rising and falling in unison. The firelight played across their faces, making the scars on their cheeks seem to glow. Elias rose and came to her cot. He carried a small basin of water and a clean cloth. He knelt beside her, dipping the cloth in the cool water and gently dabbing a cut on her forearm she hadn't realized had reopened. His touch was impersonal, practical, yet it felt like the first act of kindness she had known in years. "He'll come for us," she whispered, the words tasting of ash. It was the first time she had offered anything of her past. Elias stopped dabbing her arm. He looked from her haunted face to the children. His own face was grim, etched with a certainty that chilled her more than the nightmare. He wet the cloth again and, with infinite care, he reached out and cooled the pale, raised line on Willow's cheek, then the matching one on Finn's. The children didn't stir. He looked back at Alara, his eyes dark and absolute in the flickering light, holding her gaze. He was no longer just a hermit in a cabin. He was the governor, the man who had tamed a territory with his will alone. "Let him come," he said, his voice a low promise of violence, a vow forged in the heart of the mountain. "If he hits you again, I'll bury him." The words hung in the air, solid and real. They were not a comfort. They were a pact, a declaration of war. In that moment, Alara knew she had not found a harbor, but a fortress. And its keeper was more dangerous than the man she was fleeing. The thaw came slowly, then all at once. The snow wept from the eaves of the cabin, and the ground softened into mud. The world was returning. Elias taught Finn how to set a snare, his large hands guiding the boy's small ones through the intricate knots. Willow, who shadowed her brother in all things, watched with rapt attention. Alara found a purpose in the domestic rhythms of the cabin, cooking and mending, bringing a semblance of order to their precarious lives. She watched Elias with the children and saw not a threat, but a guardian. He spoke little of his past, but she pieced it together from the sadness in his eyes when he looked at Willow, a sadness that spoke of a daughter lost. They were a strange, silent family of broken pieces, held together by a shared, unspoken fear. The fear arrived on a Tuesday. Elias was splitting logs in the clearing, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady heartbeat in the quiet air. He saw it first. A rider on the ridge to the east, a black silhouette against the blue sky. He was too far to make out features, but Elias knew. Trouble rode a horse like that. He finished his swing, sinking the axe head deep into the block. He straightened up, his eyes never leaving the figure. "Alara," he called, his voice calm, but with an edge that made her drop the pot she was scrubbing. She came to the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, her children flanking her like tiny sentinels. She followed his gaze to the ridge, and all the color drained from her face. "Silas," she breathed. He was not alone. 2 other riders appeared, fanning out on either side of him. They were confident, surveying the small homestead as if they already owned it. "Take the children," Elias said, his voice flat and hard. "Go to the root cellar. Bar the door from the inside. Do not come out. No matter what you hear." Alara grabbed her children's hands. Finn and Willow looked from their mother's terrified face to the calm, cold resolve on Elias's. It was Willow who spoke, the first word she had uttered in all this time. "No." Alara stared at her daughter, stunned. Finn stepped forward, his small face a mask of defiance. He pointed a trembling finger toward the ridge. Him, he said, the word a curse. Elias looked at them, then at Alara. He saw the same fire in her eyes. The terror was still there, but it was now alloyed with something harder. Rage. He nodded slowly. This was her fight as much as his. He was just the weapon she had found. All right, he said. Inside. Stay away from the door and the window. He went into the cabin, took the rifle from its pegs over the mantel, and checked the action. He grabbed a box of cartridges from a drawer. He then went to a heavy wooden chest in the corner. One Alara had never seen him open. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a matching pair of Colt revolvers, their silver handles engraved with the territorial seal. He strapped the gun belt around his waist, the weight of it settling on his hips with a familiar comfort. He was no longer Elias Vance, the grieving hermit. He was Governor Vance, and his territory was being invaded. He handed the rifle to Alara. You know how to use this? She took it, the stock smooth and cool in her hands. My father taught me. Good, he said. Shoot at anything that isn't me. He drew one of the Colts and walked out onto the porch, letting the screen door swing shut behind him. He stood there, waiting, a solitary figure of judgment. Silas and his men rode down into the clearing, their horses kicking up mud. Silas was a handsome man in a cruel way, with a confident smirk that didn't reach his eyes. He reined in his horse 20 yards from the porch. Old man, he called out, his voice laced with arrogant amusement. You've got something that belongs to me. My wife, my children. Send them out, and we'll be on our way. Elias rested his hand on the butt of his pistol. They're not your property, and this is my land. Be on your way. Silas's smirk widened. This is your only warning. I don't have a quarrel with you. He gestured to the men beside him. They were hard cases, their hands resting on their own guns. But these boys get paid to have quarrels. You made a mistake coming here, Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying across the clearing. You made a mistake when you put your hands on her. You made a bigger one when you scarred those children. Silas's face darkened. The smirk vanished. So she's been talking. That's a shame. He nodded to the man on his right. Get him. The man spurred his horse forward, drawing his pistol. The shot came not from Elias, but from the cabin. The rifle cracked, and the man jerked in his saddle, a red flower blooming on his shoulder. He cried out and fell from his horse. Silas and the other man stared, shocked. They hadn't counted on a second gun. That was all the time Elias needed. His Colt was in his hand, the report deafening in the enclosed valley. The second hired gun slumped over his horse's neck, a neat hole in his chest. Silas, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, yanked his own pistol free and fired wildly at the cabin. Splinters flew from the porch posts. Elias didn't flinch. He walked calmly down the steps, his pistol held steady. This is between you and me, Silas, he said. Silas fired again, the bullet kicking up dirt at Elias's feet. Elias kept walking, closing the distance. You're a coward. You prey on women and children. They are mine. Silas screamed, his composure shattered. He fired his last shot, the bullet whining past Elias's ear. He stared in horror at his empty gun as Elias came to a stop 10 feet away. The clearing was silent save for the groans of the wounded man and the nervous stamping of the horses. I made a promise, Elias said, his voice cold as a grave. He raised his pistol. Silas's eyes went wide. He threw his gun down. Wait, you can have her. Take them. I don't want them. Elias's finger tightened on the trigger. He saw the fire again, the one that took his own family. He saw his failure to protect them. This time would be different. He would not fail. He would keep his vow. The shot echoed off the mountains, a final, definitive punctuation mark. The aftermath was quiet, somber. Alara came out of the cabin, the rifle held loosely in her hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. The children followed, clinging to her skirt, their faces filled with a terrible, ancient understanding. Elias stood over the body of Silas, the smoke from his pistol curling into the clean mountain air. He had fulfilled his vow. He had buried him not in the ground, but in the past where he belonged. The wounded man Elias tied to his horse and sent back down the mountain with a message scrawled on a piece of leather. Stay away. They worked together, Elias and Alara, to clean the clearing, to erase the stain of the violence. They did not speak of what had happened, but a new understanding passed between them. He was wounded, a shallow graze on his arm from one of Silas's wild shots. She cleaned it and bandaged it, her touch as gentle and practical as his had been. Her fear was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet strength. Spring arrived in earnest. The world turned green. The mud dried, and the wildflowers bloomed on the slopes. The cabin, once a refuge of grief and fear, began to feel like a home. Elias, with Finn and Willow at his side, tilled a small patch of earth near the porch. He showed them how to drop seeds into the furrows, how to cover them gently. Their small voices, no longer trapped by trauma, filled the air with questions and laughter. Alara watched from the porch swing Elias had repaired, a true, gentle smile gracing her lips. The scars on her children's faces remained, faint silver lines against their sun-kissed skin, but they were no longer brands of ownership. They were markers of survival, reminders of the vow a quiet man had made and kept. Elias looked up from the garden, his gaze meeting hers across the small distance. In his eyes, she no longer saw a ghost haunted by the past, but a man planting a future. The silence that fell between them was not empty. It was full of promise, a shared peace earned in violence and sealed in devotion. They had found each other on the mountain, for broken souls, and in the shadow of its granite peaks, they had become whole. They had become a family,